It's another OpenChain webinar. We have a speaker, we have a nice topic, and we have a span of up to an hour to cover it. This time we're going to be taking a look at some practitioner guides from a sister project of OpenChain called CHAOSS. And that's going to be one of those cases where some very interesting resources have surfaced that may be directly applicable to our mission of a more trusted supply chain. Now, before we do the fun part of the actual webinar, we get to do the most typical part, which is the antitrust policy notice. You'll find the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. And of course, if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. If you're not from a member company, you can ask questions of your own counsel. Onwards. The blurb is done. It's time to talk about our speaker. So we're very fortunate today to have Dawn join us. Dawn has been doing an awful lot around open source for a great many years. I do advise you to go visit her LinkedIn. You'll see it at the QR code to get the full lowdown on all of the things she's done in the last couple of decades as open source and open innovation more generally has gone mainstream. The key thing for this particular talk is to know that Dawn is leading the data science side of the CHAOSS project. And she's also a governing board member over there. So she's very central to the CHAOSS project, and the CHAOSS project is all about things like metrics. How do we make sure that we can tell what's happening with the numbers, as opposed to the traditional way that we do things in all forms of business, which is to have a hunch and hope for the best. Dawn also does other stuff. She's a board member at Open UK. She's a co-chair at the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group, and no doubt dozens of things that aren't squeezed onto this slide and contribute both to her knowledge and the fact that we're lucky to have her time today. With that, I shut up and I hand over to Dawn to talk about the practitioner guides at CHAOSS.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Let me just get my slides on the screen. Okay, so you should see my slides. If not, just give me a shout.
Everything looks great.
Perfect. I will mention first that I have already uploaded the slides, so you can download those if you go to the fastwonderblog.com speaking page. So that's my personal website. Excuse me, you can find the slides there. So the focus on this presentation is on using metrics to improve project health and sustainability. So open source projects aren't static. They aren't healthy or not healthy, sustainable or not sustainable. It's all on a continuum. And one of the advantages of using open source is that we can work within these projects to improve the health and sustainability. So that's what I'm going to focus on for this presentation. First, just a quick thank you to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who funds the CHAOSS Data Science Initiative, along with the Linux Foundation and Ford Foundation, who also support the CHAOSS project. I feel like I don't need to go into any detail about me because Shane gave me a fabulous introduction, so I'm just going to skip this slide altogether. But I will start the presentation. I'll start with a quick overview of the CHAOSS project, along with some thoughts on how to approach metrics to improve the sustainability of your projects. We'll look at health and sustainability across 4 separate categories: responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, and security. And then we'll wrap it up with a few final thoughts. But first, the CHAOSS project. So CHAOSS with 2 S's stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So we're an open source project. We are a Linux Foundation project. We have people all over the world. We are, and I'm maybe just a little bit biased, but I think that we're an absolutely lovely place to spend some time and contribute. We are not, and this causes a lot of confusion with the word health, we are not focused on medical health at all, just open source health. We're not for profit. We don't have any specific mandate. We're, as I said, a Linux Foundation project. And we're not only focused on code contributions, so you'll see that a little bit in the next slide as well. So there are loads of ways to get engaged with the CHAOSS project. One of the easiest ways to get started is just to find an area of the project that you're passionate about and, time zone permitting, attend some meetings. Or all of our meeting notes and videos are available online. So you can just have a look at a video if you're interested in a topic, or you can browse through our meeting notes for a particular meeting. And in particular, a lot of people do start by joining some of our working groups. So we have meetings and Slack channels for all of our working groups. I personally am pretty active within the OSPO and data science working groups, along with some of the other metrics working groups. If you're interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have a working group for that. But we also have badging programs where we award events and, more recently, projects with DEI badges for their outstanding work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our CHAOSS Africa chapter is very active, and we've recently started our CHAOSS Asia chapter. So we had it for a while, and then it went a bit dormant, and then we've restarted it again with Divya Mohan from India organizing it. And then we also have two different software projects, which I think is what a lot of people know CHAOSS for. So we have Augur, which is a project that's run mostly out of the University of Missouri with Sean Goggins as the primary maintainer. And we have Grimoire Lab, which is run mostly out of Madrid with the Bitergia team. And you can use either of those tools to gather and analyze your metrics. Now, one of the biggest challenges people have with data, and this is why we have a data scientist within the CHAOSS project now, is that this data can be overwhelming. This is especially true if you're looking at metrics for open source projects where all of the data is just available to gather and analyze. And too often, I see people measuring what's easy to count and easy to understand, like stars and forks, which don't really tell you much about the health of your project. Quite a few metrics tools, including the ones we have within CHAOSS, display what I affectionately call a wall of metrics. So these are pages and pages of visualizations that you can use to understand your open source project. But they require you to know what you're looking at and know where to focus your energy to get the data that you actually need. We have visualizations for dozens and dozens of metrics, and all of them can be useful, but which ones you should focus on depend on what you want to achieve within your project or within your organization. And ideally, you should be looking at visualizations that help you find areas where you can improve or ways that you can measure whether you're achieving your goals as a project. Now, within the CHAOSS project, we've historically focused on metrics, definitions, and collections of metrics called metrics models, along with the software, as I mentioned earlier, so Augur and Grimoire Lab, that allow you to collect and visualize the metrics. And we've also had a heavier focus in the past on contribution metrics, which tend to be used by community managers and other people who want to find ways to improve open source projects from within. But lately, and this is where I think some of the stuff is maybe more relevant to the OpenChain project, lately we've expanded into some consumption metrics to help OSPOs and others understand the viability of the open source projects that they're consuming. And these viability metrics models were developed by Gary White from Verizon. But, a big part of using data is figuring out what questions you have and how you can take this tsunami of data to figure out which metrics can help you turn it into something meaningful, which is where our practitioner guides come in. So we know that people get overwhelmed by the data. So we created a new practitioner guide series, each focused on a single topic to help you get started. But the real value of these guides isn't in the data, but in how you take the data you have and use it to make meaningful improvements to open source projects. So as I said, the CHAOSS project just launched this practitioner guide series, and these guides are designed to be used by people who may or may not be experts in data analysis or even experts in open source. to help them understand how to interpret that incoming tsunami of data with the goal of finding ways to improve the health of those projects or understand the health of those projects. Now, the guides are useful for anyone who wants to better understand project health or take action on what they learn from their metrics to make their projects more sustainable. So we have an introduction guide and guides on 4 topics that I'll talk about in the next few slides, and we have more guides coming soon. Now, these guides are all MIT licensed, so they're all open source, and each guide contains a link to where you can find the guide in our data science working group repository on GitHub. So you're welcome to fork the repo and customize any of these guides to meet the needs of your OSPO or the needs of your organization. And of course, we hope people will make suggestions and contributions to make these guides better over time. And we're also working on developing new guides. So if there's a guide that you'd like to see, come talk to me and we can talk about maybe developing it. Now, there's also an introduction guide, and this guide talks about how there really is no one-size-fits-all approach to using metrics. That would be really easy. But every open source project is a little different, and metrics should always be interpreted with the needs of that project taken into account. And one of the best places to start isn't actually with the metrics, but by spending some time understanding the overall goals for your project. And if your organization is driving a project, you should understand the goals for your organization and how they apply to that project. By thinking strategically about the overall goals, you'll be in a much better place to decide what you need to measure to determine whether the project is achieving its goals. And by focusing on the goals, you can develop a metric strategy that helps you focus on the metrics that matter most for you. One key to doing this well is in interpretation of your open source metrics. So the real experts are the people who are involved in the day-to-day work on the project. So you really do need to collaborate with key people from the project, since they can help you interpret the metrics and any trends identified in ways that make the most sense for that particular project. And when deciding if something is a problem or a concern that needs to be addressed, your contributors can help to decide whether the issue might be a temporary fluctuation instead of a real problem. What else is happening in that community, that project, or that ecosystem? Was there a big conference, a major release? Maybe everybody's based in Europe and they're all off on July and August because that's vacation season. Or are there other things that impacted people's time to make those contributions? And it can help to overlay these on a graph and understand their impact better. And if it looks like there's some sort of an impact from these temporary fluctuations, you might want to wait to see if the metrics rebound on their own after that temporary disruption before making any changes to try to improve things. Now, once you decide that you do need to improve in a particular area, it's really important for this step to have buy-in from the community and the project leadership before you start taking any action toward making improvements. Not having support from the project could lead to the changes being ineffective, disruptive, or frankly, even damaging for the project and the people contributing to it. The Introduction Practitioner Guide has many more details, and it's designed to get you thinking about what you might want to measure and how to measure it, along with some general tips and cautions. And it's meant to complement the topics in all of the other practitioner guides, which I will talk about in the rest of the presentation. It's important for projects to respond to contributions in a timely manner, because a quick response can help you retain contributors who might otherwise become discouraged if they don't receive a timely response. Timely, thoughtful, and kind responses to contributors indicate that you appreciate their work. Being responsive to the contributions of other people helps grow the community and improve contributor sustainability, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And while quick responses are important, it's also important to keep up with change requests, so pull requests or merge requests, and resolve them in a timely manner, even if the response is closing requests that aren't going to be merged. It's really easy to get behind on incoming contributions, and we all get behind sometimes. But not addressing these contributions promptly just creates technical debt and reduces the chances that they will ever be merged, because older change requests are likely to have so many merge conflicts that they just become too difficult to accept. Now, it can be tempting to attempt to solve issues with responsiveness by just putting more pressure on those existing maintainers and asking them to respond more quickly and resolve more contributions. But this rarely solves the long-term problem. It might result in short-term gains, but it could be damaging to the community and the project and the people in it over time if you're burning out your maintainers by not resolving the underlying problems that are causing the lack of responsiveness in the first place. So if you see responsiveness declining, there are a few things you might do. So first, it can help to set expectations and help contributors understand when they might expect a response. It also might be time to move more contributors into leadership roles and promote some trusted contributors to become maintainers for your project, which I'll talk more about on the next slide. And finally, you might also want to create or improve your issue and change request templates to make it easier for people to make high quality submissions that require less work from maintainers. And the Responsiveness Practitioner Guide has a bunch of other details about ways to improve the responsiveness for the projects you care about. Now, if you're consuming these projects and not necessarily working within, a lot of the same advice applies, because you can look at whether they're keeping up with change requests, whether they're responding quickly to contributions, and think about that from a viability standpoint for the projects that you're using and that you care about. Contributor sustainability is an important part of assessing whether an open source project and community has enough contributors for the project to be sustained over the long term. So contributor sustainability has a large impact on overall project sustainability and project viability. There are a lot of projects with a single maintainer, but when selecting new ones, it's important to promote established contributors and think about the trustworthiness of these potential new maintainers to avoid the situations like the recent one with the XC project, where they ended up with a malicious maintainer. Many projects struggle to find enough people to actively participate in their projects and continue to maintain them over the long term. And the reality is that there are a lot of open source projects and not enough contributors. So maintainers are in desperate need for help across the various types of contributions needed to have a successful, secure, and sustainable open source project. It's important to think about how to better utilize your existing maintainers, while also looking at barriers to contributions that might be preventing participation from potential new contributors. And if there are not enough contributors to sustain a project, this increases the risk that the project will fail, which creates a variety of often significant challenges for the users, the organizations, and the other projects that depend on that technology. There are a couple of things that measuring contributor sustainability can tell you. So first of all, how big of an issue is the current contributor situation? So if it's like the one on the slide, you really should focus on getting a few more people who can contribute and eventually be moved into leadership roles like maintainer. And you also might find that there are people who are contributing more than you realized, which can help you think about who you can encourage to contribute more. Or maybe find someone who could move into a maintainer role or other leadership role. Reaching out to someone and acknowledging their work while encouraging them to do more can help quite a bit with growing your contributor base. Sometimes people just need a bit of encouragement, and you can ask them for specific things that you know they're good at. There are several communities that I've gotten more involved in because someone asked for my specific help. Now, the catch here, and with all metrics, is that we don't want to just think about the people who are making commits. It's a good start, but you should also be thinking about how you can move people into leadership positions to be responsible for things that might not show up in your existing data, like documentation, community management, marketing, and other important roles. And these activities take up valuable time from maintainers, and someone with expertise in these roles can help the project become more sustainable. It's also important to look at your contribution guides or other onboarding documentation to make sure that new contributors can easily get started with your project. Good documentation is how we scale the things that take up precious time from the already overworked maintainers and free up their time to work on other things. And if this is well documented, new contributors can get started with a minimal amount of help from existing maintainers, which can save you a lot of time in the long run and reduce frustration for maintainers who get tired of answering the same questions over and over and over. And the practitioner guide linked on the slide has even more suggestions about how to improve contributor sustainability for open source projects. We don't always spend enough time thinking about how organizational participation impacts the sustainability and viability of open source projects. So you should also look at organizational diversity as part of the health and risk for open source projects. If all or most of the contributions are from people at a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy or gets acquired by a company that doesn't like open source very much, or frankly, just runs out of money and goes out of business? Would the project be able to continue if that leading company pulled all of its employees off the project for whatever reason? These single vendor open source projects might not seem risky, but they can quickly become unviable after a licensing change, for example, or when everyone just stops working on that project. If most of the work is being done by people at a single organization, the project might be riskier to use and harder to contribute to than a project with contributions that are spread out over many organizations, with no single organization being dominant. Now, the biggest challenge with identifying trends for organizations and open source projects is that the organizational affiliation data is almost never accurate enough to use without some manual cleanup. So this isn't necessarily easy, and this is described in more detail in the practitioner guide linked on the slide, along with some thoughts on how to clean up some of that organizational data. Now, improving organizational participation depends a lot on whether or not you work for that dominant organization. If you work for that dominant organization, you might want to focus on getting more contributors from other organizations by reaching out to people or customers that you know are using the project and might be interested in contributing. It's also important to improve transparency so that all of the work is happening in the open, which makes it easier for people from other organizations to contribute. And this might require, frankly, training your staff on how to work in the open. And I know the Linux Foundation has loads of training courses for that as well. Now, if you don't work for that dominant organizations, one of the best things you can do is encourage your employees to contribute to the project by actually giving them time during work to make contributions so that you can have a say in that project. And this is all described in more detail in the practitioner guide. Now, the newest guide in this series is all about security. It's important to think about security and its impact on project sustainability and viability. One thing I look for when assessing sustainability is whether the project actually makes regular releases and quickly patches security vulnerabilities. So in addition to just looking at the project itself, it's also important to look at the dependencies. And we have a libyear metric that can help you see whether the project also keeps their dependencies up to date, since outdated dependencies can be a pretty significant security risk. And people tend not to trust projects with unpatched security vulnerabilities and are more likely to adopt projects that they trust to be more secure. So in short, projects that take a proactive approach by having a security policy, addressing security issues, and releasing fixes are more sustainable over the long term. Now, one of the best places to start when improving your security practices is by securing your code repository. So this includes managing access, branch protection, and managing your contributors who have access to that repository. Another good starting point is creating a detailed policy, usually in a security.md file. And the purpose of this document is to provide instructions for privately reporting security vulnerabilities, along with documenting how you respond to those reports, including managing embargoes. And dependencies require a thoughtful approach with testing to make sure that you aren't breaking something else when updating a dependency. And while there are actually good reasons to avoid updating certain dependencies, in most cases, dependencies aren't updated because it can just be difficult to keep track of when they should be updated. And a tool like Dependabot or RenovateBot can help identify and potentially automatically update certain types of dependencies. It's also important to make sure that your security fixes land in a release in a timely fashion. So these aren't necessarily big releases. These are the little point releases that happen in between the big releases. But if you make security patches often and don't get them in one of those point releases quickly, then you should probably look at why this happens and see if you can improve your release process to make more frequent releases when you fix vulnerabilities. And many of these improvements are really well documented in the OpenSSF best practices badge criteria. So even if you don't plan to actually apply for a badge, working your way through the OpenSSF best practices badge criteria is a good way to make security improvements. And as always, you can find more details in our security practitioner guide. And then from a viability standpoint, if you're using projects, one of the places that I would start is by looking at that security.md file and seeing what their security process is, and looking at the OpenSSF scorecard for security scores. So those are ways that you can think about the viability of some of the projects that you consume, but not necessarily contribute to. Now, building sustainable open source projects over the long term can be a challenge. Project leaders and contributors are busy, busy people, and they don't always have time to focus on growing a community and maintaining their software alongside of all of their other maintainer commitments. Using metrics is one way to help open source projects identify potential issues and areas where they can improve the project to make it more sustainable over the long term. Being proactive about improving sustainability before it becomes a crisis can help make our software more sustainable and reliable for all of us. And the other thing to really spend some time thinking about as you consume open source software is which of those projects you're consuming are really important and really strategic for your organization. And think about how you can contribute back to be able to make improvements that would improve the viability and the sustainability of those projects that you consume. Because that is one of the best ways to make projects more viability is to spend some more viable is to spend some time in those projects and having a say in what's going on and helping to allow your employees to help make improvements within that project. Now, with that, I will say thank you and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dawn. And just for everyone, I've given the ability for people to unmute themselves so you can ask a question directly. And just to get it started, one thing you said, Dawn, really resonated with me. People often like to measure easy things as opposed to appropriate things. And it's certainly something, we've noticed as a standards project that a lot of people try to measure, let's say, GitHub commits. And that's not entirely relevant when you're writing an ISO standard, where commits to, let's say, a standard are infrequent, purposefully so. So working out what you should measure it is quite the challenge indeed. As an informal kind of approach, do you have any suggestions for the mindset people should take in trying to triage that challenge?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the ways that I've approached this in the past, so I can give you kind of an example. So when I worked at Pivotal, before they were acquired by VMware, I was responsible for our upstream Kubernetes contribution strategy. And one of the ways that I justified having people work on the Kubernetes project was I actually took our overall, like our company goals. And then I took those down a level to what are the goals for, some of our products and our product organizations. And then I took the work that we were doing within Kubernetes and tried to fit that underneath the things that we were doing. And then, come up with measurements that supported those overall goals so that I could connect everything together all the way up to the top of the goals of the organization. So you can think about that from either like an organization, like a company, or from a project standpoint. So the goals, as you mentioned, for a specification are very, very different than the goals for something like a Kubernetes. And so I think the best place to start is by really documenting and thinking about those goals that you have for your organization, for the project, for however you need to break that down, and then figure out what metrics help you decide whether or not you're successful. Because like you said, numbers of commits aren't necessarily going to be important for a specification. But I assume that there are other things that you can measure that would be. I honestly don't work on specifications, so I don't really know what those might be.
No, it's very helpful to, I think, just flag to people that they should carefully consider what would be appropriate to measure and take it from there. Everyone else, the floor is open in case you have a question or two, you can just unmute yourselves and ask directly. While we're giving people a chance to gather their thoughts, I did want to ask about the role you have in CHAOSS now as leading the data side. Does this indicate that CHAOSS as a project is planning to scale? Will there be more software, or is it more a case of ensuring things like these guides and communication helps people think through metrics?
Yeah, this particular role was created to fill a gap. So historically, because every open source project is different, and you really do need to interpret the metrics based on your individual situation and your individual project, CHAOSS had taken a very hands-off approach. So we gave people software where they could collect piles of metrics. We defined those metrics so that people could know what they mean. And then our response to that was, yeah, just take the metrics and figure out what you need. It'll be great. And what we found is that a lot of people just struggle to make those connections. And not necessarily because or not at all because they're not smart enough to make those connections. They are busy people. So if you think about people who work in open source program offices or even community managers, they're busy with those tasks and they can't spend all day every day looking at metrics and trying to figure out which ones might be relevant or important for them. So this role was specifically designed to help fill that gap. So it was designed to help people get started. So how to take that overwhelming amount of data and turn it into something that they can use. So that's the um, primary reason that this role was created. The other thing that we're doing is we're building a data science community within the CHAOSS project so that people can also take some of this data and do research and draw conclusions. And so we also have some research projects within the data science working group. So the first one that we started was around relicensing and forks, which I presented as a paper to the Open Forum Academy Symposium a couple of weeks ago. As there's just phase one of the research. We're still working on it. But the idea is to release some research reports to help people kind of get a broader perspective on what's going on within the industry and within open source.
That makes a lot of sense. Yari, I notice you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Maybe just a quick one. Like, do you have like some, I don't know, success stories that there was an organization, I don't know, let's say Google to pick a name, and they had a repo that was kind of like lacking behind, and then they used whatever metrics to find out, oh, by the way, they're like, I don't know, the response time for the PRs is bad, and a lot of issues, and nobody's taking care of those, and then they were able to kind of turn it around to become, let's say, I don't know, better project or whatever.
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have any of those examples off the top of my head related to these particular topics. Um, One of the other things we'd like to do within the CHAOSS project, and we have an OSPO working group, is we would like to get some case studies of how people have used metrics to do something really interesting within their organization. I can give a couple of examples, not directly related to what you said, but certainly Microsoft has done a lot. Their OSPO, so Emma Irwin and Justin Gozes and James, who I'm forgetting his surname, in their OSPO have done a lot of work with metrics and have created custom dashboards to help their maintainers understand what's going on within their projects. And they're using that data and working closely with maintainers on very specific things to improve the projects that Microsoft cares about. So I know that's one way, one example of people using data to do that. I also, Bob Killen, who's at the CNCF now, but was at Google before, has been doing some interesting presentations talking about the work that he's been doing to help people justify software engineers' time in open source projects. And he looks at very specific metrics for that. So it's things like, you know, the bugs that they've submitted and how many of them get closed by patches that they've submitted, and how many of them are submitted by community members. So they're getting help with the things that are important for them. And looking at things like time to close for the pull requests that are submitted by people within the community, and comparing those to pull requests that are submitted by people who aren't participating actively in the community, and using some of that data to justify having software engineers work on projects. So I think there are examples around. I think it's just kind of hard to pull those together. If anybody has any case studies of what you've done, I'd love to hear about it, and maybe write up a case study for the CHAOSS project.
Now we actually have two questions in from Bernard.
Yeah.
They're in the chat. The first one is essentially, at what stage is it right to begin considering metrics? I mean, should people start with metrics from the very beginning of a project?
I would say actually, and maybe this is counter to what we tend to do within the CHAOSS project. I would say actually, no, you probably don't want to necessarily start with the metrics unless you're creating a project for a very specific purpose within an organization, and it needs to fulfill certain things. Then you might start with metrics from the beginning to start looking at the project over time. But the reality is that the value of metrics is really in identifying trends and what's happening in the project over time. So are things getting better or are things getting worse? And so if you start looking at metrics, like, you should gather metrics at the beginning of the project, but it's really hard for those metrics to tell you anything until have maybe 3 to 6 months of data. And during that first 3 to 6 months of a project, you're also still sort of figuring out how the project works, and what you thought was going to be super important on day one might not be. So it's a little bit hard because these projects evolve, and looking at the data over time is where I think the value is. So I would start collecting metrics because they're going to be useful later, but I wouldn't necessarily focus on them at the beginning of the project. I would focus on, you can look at the OpenSSF best practices badge criteria, which is not just for security. Frankly, it's about really good software engineering practices. And I would focus on just, doing the work that you need to do to get the basic features and functionality out on your project. Spend the time on that and put some basic things in place that you're going to need: a contributing guide, a code of conduct. Put together some basic infrastructure for your project, and I'd focus on that, and then focus on the metrics in 3 to 6 months.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a secondary one from Bernard, which I think was partially addressed earlier, but he was just asking about tools to measure metrics. And we know that CHAOSS has a couple, but are there a range of tools that people can use, or is it confined to what we'd find in CHAOSS?
No, there are loads of tools that you can use. I'm obviously a little bit biased. It's the ones for CHAOSS. So we have two tools. There's one called Augur. There's one called Grimoire Lab. Now these tools, I'll be honest, are not necessarily super easy to get started with, to install and use and continue to collect metrics over time. They're both of these tools collect basically everything. So you point them at a repository, and Grimoire Lab does some other things other than repositories, but you point them at a data source and it gathers all the stuff about the data source, which is great. If you're a community manager, you need to know all of the things. For other people, you might not need the CHAOSS tools, and there are loads of kind of free things that you can use online. So OpenSauce, which just got acquired actually by the Linux Foundation, is now working with LFX. But OpenSauce is, I think it's like opensauce.pizza or something. It has a really strange URL. But they gather data on lots of open source projects that you can have a look at. And I think you can add your own projects there. We do have within the CHAOSS project, we also have, and I'll drop the link here, we have a we have a software as a solution. Sorry, let me just grab the URL because I can't talk while I type. Here we go. Where you can actually add your own. Oh yeah, thanks, Yari. That is exactly what I was talking about. So the metrics.chaoss.io is a hosted software as a service version of Augur, where you can log in and sign up, and you can add your own repositories to that. So you can add repositories that you want to look at. And we have this 8-knot interface that's developed by some lovely folks at Red Hat who that you can use to visualize some of that data. So that's another option. And honestly, like the GitHub Insights tab has a fair amount of data that is really useful for getting started. You can see who's contributing, how much they're contributing. You can look at, dependencies and dependents. I think there's some basic security information. There's a lot of data that you can get just through the GitHub interface if you happen to use GitHub. And the GitHub API, if you're a little bit more sophisticated and want to write a little bit of code, the GitHub GraphQL API, for example, you can get very specific data. And I frankly use that quite a lot in addition to the CHAOSS tools, because I just want to quickly pull some data, and sometimes it's easier just to grab a couple of chunks of data from the GitHub API than it is to gather all the data about a repository. So you have lots of options, is what I'm saying.
That's super fantastic. Thank you, Dawn. And
yeah,
we have time if someone has any final question. And if not, I will just end with, I guess, the most obvious one. If people want to lend a hand, where should they start with CHAOSS? How can they be part of helping develop this?
Yes, absolutely. So you can go to chaoss.community, and we have, and I think it was linked on one of the earlier slides about the CHAOSS project. There's a getting started guide, which can help you get connected to the places where you might want to participate in the CHAOSS project. The easiest place to start is by joining our Slack channel, because we have lots of discussions. We post meeting reminders. We have lots of channels on very specific topics, so you can pick something that you're interested in and join the channel. We have working groups on on lots of different topics for university open source program offices. We have a new working group that is looking at the UN software development goals. And sorry, not that's the wrong thing. Sustainable development goals. They're not all about software, but looking at how people are using software to achieve the sustainability goals for the UN SDGs, and we're looking at how we can use metrics to help them determine the success of that. The CHAOSS earrings, I 3D print those myself. I designed and printed them because 3D printing is apparently now my new hobby. My partner bought a 3D printer, and now we've actually expanded, and now we have a second one because I couldn't get enough. But I've printed, and I'll just drop a link in here. I've printed CHAOSS earrings. I've printed. I also have OpenUK earrings, and so CHAOSS community members are called chaotics. And so I've printed some chaotic pendants, which we're gonna have at CHAOSScon right before FOSDEM. So that's another way, if you happen to be going to FOSDEM and would like to attend CHAOSScon, it is the Thursday before FOSDEM. And yeah, and maybe you could get a pair of great chaos earrings or a pendant to turn into a necklace or a keychain.
Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. And with that, I guess we begin to wrap. I really appreciate you coming here. It's our first time to have a look at chaos in this way, and I hope it will not be by any means the last. So great thanks, and I will see you probably at FOSDEM, along with many of our community. Until then, take care, be well, be healthy, and the same applies to our entire audience.